at 0612 hours. February 23, 1945, the northern slope of Mount Suribebi, Iwo Jima. The flag had gone up 20 minutes ago. Nobody in Charlie Company had seen it. They were too busy dying. Private First Class Eli Tanner was already bleeding when the cave opened up. Not a cave the map showed. Not a cave that was supposed to exist at grid reference 114 Echo. A cave that had been blasted shut 3 days ago and had apparently decided to unblast itself because the Japanese didn't seal caves from the outside. They sealed them from the inside. And they waited. He felt the shot before he heard it. That was always the tell with a Type 99 rifle. The sound lagged behind the impact, a fraction of a second, just long enough to make you think the world had hiccuped. Tanner went sideways off the volcanic ridge, catching the edge of a black rock shelf with his right shoulder, and landed in a crouch that should have broken his ankle, but didn't, because Iwo Jima seemed determined to keep him alive for something worse. Cave. Right. 30 yards. He wasn't sure if he was yelling to his squad or just to the air. Both felt equally unlikely to help. The black sand was already moving, not with men, with bullets. Dozens of them, stitching a line across the volcanic gravel 6 inches from Tanner's left boot. A Type 96 light machine gun. He could tell by the interval, the hiccup-pause-hiccup rhythm of the feed mechanism jamming on the coarse black grit that Iwo Jima put in everything. He had maybe 2 seconds before the gunner compensated. He took 4. Because Eli Tanner did not move like a man following a field manual. He moved like a man who had studied the way animals use ground, the way a boar moves through brush, presenting no silhouette, no shadow, and he had learned that from a man who would have laughed himself sick at the idea of a military field manual, his Uncle Deo. But that's getting ahead of this story. He was behind a concrete lip, a blast wall, or what remained of one, when the second wave of fire came in. 3 riflemen this time, from positions that should have been behind American lines, because they were. A tunnel that ran under the perimeter they'd spent 4 days establishing. Sergeant Willard, 4 feet to Tanner's left, was already on the radio, voice absolutely flat, Charlie 2 to actual, we have breach at 114 Echo, requesting mortar support, over, static, and then something else entirely. A sound nobody in the squad recognized. A sound that hadn't been in the pre-mission briefing, hadn't been in the after-action reports from Red Beach, hadn't been documented in any intelligence packet that Charlie Company had ever received. A sound like a freight train inhaling. Then, silence. Tanner pressed himself against the blast wall, looked left at Willard, and for the first time in 3 weeks on this island, saw Sergeant Willard afraid. What was that? Willard whispered. Tanner didn't answer immediately, because he already had a theory, and the theory made him reach for the weapon strapped across his back, the one that wasn't in any field manual, the one Lieutenant Hargrove had very nearly ordered him to leave on the ship, the one that had taken him 6 weeks, and one spectacular near disaster to build, the one that in approximately 4 hours would be echoing through Japanese radio chatter as a 2-word phrase he understood perfectly. Ochiru Hoshi. Falling Star. What Standard Issue America brought to Iwo Jima, and what Iwo Jima thought about that number. 21,000. That was the Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima, every one of them underground. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 8 months turning a volcanic island barely 5 miles long into the most thoroughly fortified position in the Pacific War. Not foxholes, not trenches, 17 miles of interconnected tunnels blasted through volcanic rock with concrete reinforced firing positions that could be sealed, evacuated, and reopened on a timer. The American invasion plan called for the island to fall in 4 days. We were on day 8. Charlie Company, 28th Marine Regiment, 5th Marine Division, had been fighting uphill since February 19th. Their assignment: seize the northern slope approaches to Suribebi, eliminate fortified positions along the ridgeline, and punch a corridor for follow-on forces to exploit. Standard infantry doctrine: move, fire, advance, hold what you take. The problem was that nothing on Iwo Jima stayed taken. A pillbox that 4 Marines died clearing at 0900 would have fresh Japanese soldiers firing from it by 1400. Not because the Japanese had teleported. Because the tunnel network ran beneath the position, and the moment American troops pushed past it, the garrison below simply re-emerged. You could clear a bunker, mark it as clear, and be shot in the back from it 3 hours later. The standard issue M9A1 Bazooka, the primary American anti-armor, anti-fortification weapon at squad level, was genuinely impressive against most of what the European theater threw at it. Concrete walls up to about 18 inches. Light armor. Field fortifications. Against a Japanese Type 94 pillbox built from reinforced concrete 2.5 feet thick, with a firing aperture 3 inches wide and a firing angle that negated frontal approach. The M9A1 was firing a 3.5-pound rocket that hit like a fist wrapped in fire. The pillbox felt it the way a mountain feels rain. Do that arithmetic. 2.5 feet of reinforced concrete. The standard M9A1 Bazooka rocket penetrated 9 inches of concrete under ideal conditions. On Iwo Jima, the conditions were always the opposite of ideal, uphill approach, volcanic dust fouling the propellant igniter, black sand getting into the piezoelectric trigger mechanism, humidity warping the fin assembly during the sea crossing. Lieutenant Hargrove, 2nd Platoon Leader, West Point Class of 42, a man who believed that the solution to every tactical problem was to find the right page in the right manual and execute it correctly, had been requesting additional flame tanks since day 3. The request had been approved, denied, reapproved, and delayed by 4 separate logistics jams. The tanks were coming. They were always coming. In the meantime, the standard answer to a pillbox was a 4-man fire team, 60 feet of covered approach, 2 men suppressing, 2 men flanking, white phosphorus grenade into the aperture if you could get close enough, and hope the aperture wasn't covered with a steel plate that had already stopped 3 grenades from 3 different men. Tanner had watched the approved method kill 6 of his people in 2 days. He'd said so to Hargrove on day 5, directly, which went about as well as you'd expect. Tanner, I understand your frustration. We follow the doctrine because it works at scale. One soldier's improvised solution is one soldier's accident. Tanner had said nothing back, which, if you knew Eli Tanner, was itself a kind of answer. Because on day 5, he had also found something. On the beach, half buried in black sand, 40 yards from where a Corsair had gone down on day 2, not crashed, exactly, but belly landed with one wheel gone and the pilot walking away, he had found a 5-inch VAR. High-velocity aircraft rocket. Still in its launch rail attachment, the warhead had not detonated on impact. And the fin assembly, the triple fin stabilizer that the Navy had started using on HVARs in '44 to improve accuracy in low-altitude runs, was not only intact, it was perfect. He didn't tell Hargrove he'd found it. He told Willard to cover for him. And he got to work. What a boy from Macon, Georgia learned before the war made him useful, Eli Tanner, was from Macon, Georgia, 22 years old. Before the war he had been, in order, a machinist's apprentice at the Bibb Manufacturing Company, an amateur radio tinkerer, a deer hunter of considerable local reputation, and through no particular choice of his own, the only kid in his high school who could read a Japanese newspaper. That last one was his uncle's fault. Reverend Dio Tanner had spent 12 years as a missionary in Okinawa and the Ryukyu Islands before the war made that impossible. He came back to Macon in 1940, speaking Japanese the way most men speak about things they love, too much, too fast, and with an expectation that the listener would keep up. Young Eli had spent summers with Dio. Summers that meant learning to read hiragana before he could read cursive, learning to count in Japanese before he ever thought to wonder why, learning to hear the difference between a sentence ending in command and one ending in question. He wasn't fluent. He was never fluent. What he had was something stranger and more useful. An ear for emotional register, for urgency, for the specific panic cadence of a man who has just been told something he doesn't want to believe. He could pick up maybe one word in 4 from Japanese radio chatter, but those 4 words were usually the ones that mattered most. Flank, run, weapon, fear. The machinist work mattered more on Iwo Jima. Bibb Manufacturing made textile equipment, looms, shuttles, mechanical assemblies requiring tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Tanner had spent 3 years learning that metal has a logic, that every component has a reason for its shape, and that if you understood the reason, you could adapt the shape. His foreman, a large German immigrant named Oberst, who had somehow never served in any military, used to say, "If it has moving parts, you can understand it. If you can understand it, you can change it." That was the philosophy Tanner brought to the beach at Iwo Jima, with a salvaged VAR fin assembly and an M9A1 Bazooka tube that had already survived the sea crossing and 2 days of combat. The build took him 4 nights. He worked in a shell crater 40 yards behind the forward line, under a poncho stretched between 2 pieces of rebar he'd pulled from a blown concrete block. Willard stood watch. The HVAR was a different animal than the M9A1's round, designed for a Corsair's wing, firing at 300 miles an hour from altitude, built for velocity and penetration against ship armor. Its warhead used a different fusing mechanism entirely, a point-detonating nose fuse with a secondary incendiary payload. The incendiary wasn't phosphorus by default. It was a zirconium-based compound the Navy had started experimenting with for anti-shipping use, a coating on the inner wall of the warhead that aerosolized on detonation and burned at temperatures that made white phosphorus look conversational. Tanner could not replicate the HVAR warhead from scratch. What he could do, what Oberst's philosophy allowed him to do, was understand what each component was accomplishing and find an approximation using what he had. The M9A1 standard-shaped charge warhead came apart under his hands like a watch he'd disassembled 100 times. The contact fuse, the shaped charge liner, the piezoelectric trigger, the propellant stabilizer in the rocket body. He worked backward from the design, asked himself what each part was doing, and then asked himself what he could replace, augment, or remove. He replaced the standard-shaped charge with a dual-chamber design. The front chamber, standard-shaped charge for concrete penetration. The rear chamber, a white phosphorus grenade, modified, with its own delay fuse triggered by the impact of the front charge detonating. Hit the wall, punch through, then burn everything inside. He adapted the HVAR's triple fin stabilizer to the M9A1 rocket body. This was the part that nearly killed him. The fin assembly was designed for a rocket 3 inches wider in diameter. He machined it down. Machined is generous. He filed, clamped, and jury-rigged it, using a hand file and a vise he'd borrowed from a Marine combat engineer named Prentice, who asked no questions, and later claimed to remember nothing about a certain poncho-covered shell crater. The first test fire, Night 3, the back fin caught the edge of the launcher tube on ignition, and the round corkscrewed 30 feet and impacted a rock face sideways. The explosion was impressive. The result was useless. He changed the fin geometry, narrowed the catch angle, refiled. Tested again on Night 4, aiming at a chunk of Japanese concrete block he dragged to the crater. The round flew true, hit the block dead center. The shaped charge punched through 6 inches of reinforced concrete in a quarter of a second. Then the phosphorus chamber fired. Tanner crouched in his crater as the secondary explosion lit up a 50-foot radius in white gold fire that burned for 90 seconds on volcanic rock. He heard Willard behind him, very quietly, "Lord have mercy." "Weight's going to be a problem," Tanner said. "I lose 2 rounds per load compared to standard. And the launcher's 3 pounds heavier with the fin guide fitted." "Does it work?" Tanner looked at the burning rock. "Yeah, it works. He had 4 rounds built before dawn. He would need every one of them." The Island That Swallows Plans. Day 8. 0430 hours. Charlie Company's objective for February 23rd was a tunnel complex designated Hill 362 Alpha, a ridgeline position that 3 previous companies had attempted to crack and walked back from with reduced headcounts and no result. The plan, per Hargrove's briefing at 0400, was a standard 3-pronged advance, 2 fire teams suppressing from the flanks, 1 assault team with Tanner's modified weapon pushing up the center gully. Hargrove had not exactly blessed the modified weapon. His exact words had been, "You bring that thing, and you're outside my coverage if it kills someone on our side." That is understood. It wasn't approval. It was deniability. Tanner accepted the distinction and moved out. The first obstacle announced itself at 0445, 15 minutes into the approach, when the center gully turned out to have an 18-inch water pipe running through it, a Japanese engineering detail that didn't exist on any American map, and the pipe was rigged. Not to explosives. To a bell. The oldest alarm system on Earth. When Private Kowalski's boot caught the pipe in the dark, they heard a clear, clean ring echo down into the volcanic rock below their feet, and the firing positions on the ridge above woke up. They lost the element of surprise before they'd fired a shot. Tanner hit the deck with everyone else, heard the first burst of Type 96 fire stitch across the gully above their heads, and immediately began recalculating. The center approach was now an aisle. Anyone standing in it was standing in a gallery of fixed position fire. He grabbed Willard by the sleeve and pointed left, up the western edge of the ridge, where a fold in the volcanic rock created a shadow line that the Japanese firing positions couldn't cover without rotating their apertures outward. 40 yards of dead ground. Hargrove said center approach. Willard said. "Hargrove's not in this gully," Tanner said, and moved left. He had 40 yards of cover, and then he had nothing. At the end of the shadow line, the ridge opened onto a shelf, a flat platform of volcanic rock that offered a clean angle on the first bunker position. It also offered a clean angle from the second bunker position, which he hadn't been able to see from below. He pressed himself behind a 2-foot rock outcrop and did a fast inventory. 1 M9A1 launcher, 4 modified rounds in a canvas sling across his back, his M1 carbine, 2 grenades, 1 fighting knife, and 60 feet of visibility in the pre-dawn dark. The radio crackled on Willard's set. "Hargrove, Charlie 2, you are off designated route. Return to center approach and execute as briefed." "That is a direct order. Over." Willard looked at Tanner. Tanner said, "Tell him we're advancing from the left flank, and we'll be in position in 90 seconds. Willard translated that into something that would not get them court-martialed, and keyed the radio. The second obstacle came from below, literally below. A tunnel exit 20 feet to their right, which opened in the volcanic rock face with no warning, no sound, no light, just a 2-foot square of darkness that suddenly contained a Japanese soldier climbing out of it, already raising his Type 38 rifle. Corporal Hayes was faster. The shot was point blank. The Japanese soldier went down, but not quietly, and from somewhere in the tunnel below there was shouting. Rapid, urgent, the consonants running together in that compressed way that panic creates in any language. Tanner heard 2 words out of the noise coming up from below. "Totsugeki, Hidari, rush, left, get down and move right," he said, not explaining, not waiting to explain. He was already moving, pulling the launcher off his back, reaching for the first of his 4 rounds. They made it 8 feet before the tunnel exit erupted with 3 more soldiers coming up fast, which was exactly what he'd predicted, which was why he'd moved right instead of holding. The Japanese soldiers came up expecting to flank left and found nothing. In the 3 seconds they spent orienting, Willard and Hayes had the angle. It was brutal and fast and left nobody feeling good about it. "How did you know?" Hayes asked, afterward, still breathing hard. "He said they were coming left," Tanner said. "Who said?" Tanner had already moved on. The third obstacle was Hargrove, arriving at the western shelf with 2 men from the command section and an expression that was approximately 1 degree below court-martial on the scale of things officers project at enlisted men who disobey direct orders. "Tanner, I ordered you to hold the center approach." "The center approach would have killed us, sir. There was a rigged alarm we didn't know about." "That does not give you authority to." "I have a firing angle on Bunker 1 from this shelf, sir, right now. If we wait 20 minutes for the suppressing teams to reposition, the Japanese will seal and retunnel, and we'll lose it." Hargrove stared at him, a man caught between procedure and results. The specific, miserable place that war puts competent but rigid officers when reality stops cooperating with their training. "You have 1 shot," Hargrove said. "Finally, if it doesn't work, we fall back and wait for the flame tanks. 1 shot. 4 modified rounds." Tanner accepted the math and loaded the first one. He did not know, yet, that Bunker 1 was not where the real problem was. Remember that. He also did not know that, at this moment, in the tunnel complex below Hill 362 Alpha, a Japanese sergeant named Hayashi was writing in a field journal, later recovered and translated, his first notation about a weapon he hadn't yet seen, but had been warned about by a survivor from the previous night's engagement on the southern slope. The survivor's description had been confused, fragmented by shock, but Hayashi wrote down what he could make out: a rocket, but different. A fire that keeps burning through the rock. Not a flamethrower, something that flies. His commanding officer, Captain Morioka, had listened to the survivor's report and said, "American weapons don't fly through rock." He's confused. Hayashi had written that down too, and put a question mark after it. 0612 hours. The question gets answered. The shot at Bunker 1 was clean. almost too clean for what it needed to accomplish. Tanner had the launcher up, the modified round seated, the fin assembly locked into the extended guide rail he'd fitted to the tube. The bunker aperture was 42 feet away and slightly above his position, a downward angle that the round's trajectory would compensate for, given the triple fin stabilization. He'd worked the geometry in his head 3 times during the approach. He was as certain as a man can be on a volcanic island in the dark before dawn. He fired. The round flew straight. No corkscrew. No wobble. The triple fins did exactly what he'd filed them to do. Held the rocket's axis through its burn phase so that the shaped charge nose arrived at the aperture at the angle he'd calculated, rather than the angle Iwo Jima's crosswind would have pushed a standard round. The shaped charge hit the aperture's concrete lip, not dead center, 2 inches left of center, and punched through. 300 milliseconds later, the phosphorus chamber fired. The aperture blew out from the inside. Not collapsed inward, out, smoke, fire, and a column of white gold light that lasted 4 full seconds before the bunker's ventilation system drew it inward and down through the tunnel network below. From somewhere in those tunnels, men were screaming, not in the way of orders being shouted or positions being called, in the way that precedes nothing, that terminal, uncontrolled register that has no tactical content. Hargrove stared at the bunker. Jesus, he said, which was not in any field manual Tanner had ever read. Then the second bunker, the one Tanner hadn't seen from below, opened up. But not at Tanner, at the center gully, suppressing teams, who had finally reached their positions and were now framed perfectly against the pale sky, beginning to lighten in the east. 3 riflemen from the second bunker's aperture, firing down into men who'd been told to stay in place per the original plan. 2 Marines went down in the gully. One of them was Kowalski, who'd set off the bell pipe alarm 40 minutes ago. Tanner heard Hargrove's voice on the radio, sharp and controlled, all Charlie elements, suppress Bunker 2 position, marked for assault team. Tanner was already gone. Not toward the assault. Away from it, back down the shelf edge, across 10 feet of open ground that he crossed at a sprint, and into a shadow channel on the ridge's eastern face that nobody had been assigned to cover because it didn't appear on the approach map. He heard Willard behind him, keeping up without being told. Willard had learned, over 8 days, not to ask questions in motion. The eastern channel was a chimney, a narrow vertical crack in the volcanic rock, 20 feet deep, created by some ancient geological event that had split the ridgeline like an axe through wood. It was barely wide enough for a man with a launcher on his back. It was also completely invisible from Bunker 2's aperture. And it ran straight up to a position 12 feet above and behind that bunker. 12 feet. Behind, A by the book assault on Bunker 2 went up the front. You suppressed. You flanked. You threw white phosphorus into the aperture if you got close enough. You took casualties doing it. You accepted the math. Tanner didn't do it by the book. He went up the chimney, 30 feet of volcanic rock that cut his hands and caught the launcher on 3 separate outcroppings and made noise he couldn't afford. He went up anyway, because the eastern face was below the bunker's field of fire and below Bunker 1's wreckage, and because 12 feet above and behind was a position nobody in that bunker was watching. He made it to the top of the chimney breathing hard, launcher in hand, second round already in his left fist. Bunker 2 was below him and to the right. 6 feet of reinforced concrete, slightly domed, a single rear ventilation port on the back wall, not an aperture, not a firing position, a ventilation port, 6 inches in diameter. Tanner looked at the port. looked at his modified round. The round was wider than 6 inches by a significant margin. That port was not the target. But the ventilation port meant the tunnel ran directly beneath it, and the concrete above the tunnel was 4 inches thinner at the junction than at the main wall face. He loaded the second round, set the launcher on his shoulder, aimed at the concrete cap 4 inches above the ventilation port. He heard, from inside the bunker, a voice. Crisp, authoritative, the cadence of command, Hayashi kakunin, muk ni Amerika he gaimasu. Hayashi, confirm, there are Americans on the far side. No, there aren't, Tanner thought. He fired. The round hit the cap dead center. The shaped charge punched through 4 inches of concrete in a stroke. The phosphorus chamber fired into the tunnel below. The bunker went silent for 2 full seconds. Then the ventilation port began to glow. The fire was pulling through the tunnel network, spreading below the ridge, following the Japanese engineering with the logic of fire, which is that it goes where the air goes. Tanner could hear it spreading, not men screaming this time. The deeper, more structural sound of enclosed combustion consuming the oxygen in a confined space. He was already loading round 3 when Willard made it to the top of the chimney. "Hargrove is losing his mind on the radio," Willard said. "What's he saying?" "Where are you? What are you doing? Return to your position immediately. Tell him Bunker 2 is neutralized, and I'm proceeding to the junction complex." "Tanner, the junction complex is," tell him. The third obstacle of this phase found them on the way to the junction complex, a triple intersection of tunnels at the base of the ridge that the intelligence maps had marked as possible and which turned out to be definitively real and definitively occupied. It announced itself as a Japanese soldier emerging from a trapdoor in the volcanic rock 10 feet ahead, already raising his weapon, already at a range where the launcher was completely wrong and the M1 carbine was the only answer. Tanner got to it first. He had always been fast. His uncle Deo, who had spent 12 years in a place where patience was a martial virtue, had told him, "Fast is not better than accurate, but on days when you can only be one, be fast." He was accurate, too, 2 shots, one of which mattered. The trapdoor stayed open. From below came voices, multiple, rapid, the compressed syntax of men realizing a position has been compromised. He heard, "Heiki, otogaki koeta," weapon, I heard the sound. He didn't give them more time to contextualize the sound. He pulled the pin on his second grenade, not the modified rounds, not the launcher, just an ordinary M26 fragmentation grenade, and dropped it through the trapdoor. Moved left. Moved fast. The explosion came up through the rock like a single heartbeat. Then, from the American lines, from Hargrove's radio network, came the call that changed the math entirely. "Charlie 2, we have enemy reinforcements coming up from the southern tunnel network. Estimate 2 platoons. All Charlie elements hold position. Do not advance." Tanner stopped. He had 1 modified round left. 1, and he was 40 feet from the junction complex, with 2 enemy platoons coming up behind it. He looked at Willard. Willard looked at him. This was the moment, the one you can see in the arithmetic before it arrives, where the options collapse into one option, and the one option is the one you were told explicitly not to take. "If we hold here," Tanner said, "they come out of the junction, and they're behind our suppressing teams." Hargrove said hold. Hargrove doesn't know about the southern tunnel convergence. I do. How do you? Willard stopped. He already knew the answer. You'll want to remember this next moment. Tanner did not speak. He loaded his last round. He moved forward. The junction complex was a concrete apron at the base of the ridge, an open platform, roughly 20 by 20 feet, with 3 tunnel entrances arranged in a rough triangle. The Japanese had used it as a transfer point. Ammunition, personnel, communication lines all ran through here. It was, in the language of a military engineer, a hub. And like all hubs, if you destroyed it, everything attached to it stopped talking to everything else. Tanner reached the edge of the apron at a dead run, slid behind a 3-foot blast wall, and looked at the 3 entrances. Soldiers were emerging from the southern entrance, the largest one, center position, already forming into movement formation. He fired his last round at the concrete arch above the southern entrance. The shaped charge hit the arch's keystone. The arch held for 1 second, the way arches do, redistributing load outward to the walls, and then the phosphorus chamber fired through the puncture, into the space beyond the arch, into the tunnel itself, and the heat differential between the burning tunnel interior and the cold volcanic rock outside the arch created a pressure differential that the arch could not redistribute. The arch collapsed inward, not down, in, the entire entrance mouth folded forward like a hand closing. The soldiers who had been emerging from it went down under the concrete, and the tunnel beyond them became, in less than 2 seconds, sealed, white gold fire crawled up the outside of the collapsed arch for 30 seconds, burning against black volcanic rock. Visible from the gully below, and from the ridge above, and from the command position, where Lieutenant Hargrove stood with a radio handset and an expression that 3 separate men would later describe, in their letters home, as like he'd just watched someone be right in a way that was going to make his life complicated. From somewhere below the sealed tunnel, muffled, distorted, but audible in the suddenly very quiet moment after the arch's collapse, Tanner heard Japanese voices, low, urgent, talking to each other in the dark. He caught one phrase, clear, unmistakable, Ochiru Hoshi. Falling star. It was the first time he heard it. It would not be the last. What Iwo Jima kept, and what it sent home. The Junction Complex attack sealed 362 Alpha's primary resupply route and eliminated 41 Japanese soldiers from a position that had been assessed as requiring a full battalion-level flame tank operation to neutralize. Charlie Company's assault teams, freed from the flanking fire from bunkers 1 and 2, pushed through the ridgeline by 10:30 hours and held what they took. Kowalski lived. The 2 Marines who'd gone down in the gully on the center approach, one lived, one didn't. Private Ortega, 20 years old, from Albuquerque, had been in the Pacific Theater for 5 months. Tanner sat at the base of the ridge after the objective was secured, and he did not celebrate. He had noticed, over 2 years of war, that the men who celebrated did it partly to not think about Ortega and men like Ortega, and that not thinking about them was a way of allowing the next Ortega to happen. He wasn't sure that was entirely fair reasoning. He thought about it anyway. Hargrove's official after-action report, filed February 24th, credited the seizure of Hill 362 Alpha to effective fire and maneuver by Charlie Company elements utilizing available weapon systems. The modified launcher was described as field-expedient anti-fortification device. Tanner's name appeared exactly once, in the casualty accounting section, PFC Eli Tanner, minor lacerations, hand, returned to duty. The unofficial accounting was different. Hargrove found Tanner alone 2 hours after the action and stood with him for 30 seconds without saying anything, which was its own kind of communication from a man who filled silences with regulation. Then he said, "What you did at the junction was unauthorized and reckless and the right call. I'm not writing those last 4 words down anywhere. Tanner said. Understood, sir. The launcher, Hargrove said. Where's it going? Wherever I go. Another silence. Then, you disobeyed a direct order under fire. I have to put something in the record. Yes, sir. What Hargrove put in the record was a formal counseling notation for failure to maintain unit cohesion during approach phase. No court-martial, no charge, the kind of thing that follows a man for 2 years and then gets lost in the paperwork of a world trying to return to normal. Tanner signed it without reading it. The Japanese accounting was different in a different way. Sergeant Hayashi's journal, recovered 3 weeks later when his tunnel section was finally cleared, contained 4 separate entries referencing the weapon. The first was the confused pre-contact notation from February 22nd. The second, dated February 23rd, was more specific, phosphorus. But not phosphorus, something that passes through the wall first. Morioka says impossible. Morioka has not seen the arch at 362. Captain Morioka had seen the arch by the time the third entry was written. He had revised his assessment. His revised assessment, found in a separate document, had been transmitted up to Sector Command, and the transmission had been intercepted by American Signals Intelligence, decoded, translated, and quietly passed through channels where it eventually reached people who were paid to be interested in exactly this kind of information. The transmission described, in the careful language of a professional military officer, a man-portable weapon of unknown pattern, used by a single American soldier, capable of penetrating reinforced concrete and deploying a secondary incendiary payload inside the target. Captain Morioka's recommendation was that positions facing this weapon should not be held by direct defense. His word was spy, avoidance, as a tactical posture. Not against the Americans in general, against one specific American. The nickname Ochiru Hoshi, Falling Star, had spread through the tunnel network not through command channels, but through the informal way that dangerous things spread in any army, from the men who had seen it to the men who hadn't, gaining weight with each telling. By the time the battle moved north, away from Suribebi and toward the airfields, the nickname had been carried by survivors to positions Tanner had never visited. There were Japanese soldiers in sectors Charlie Company never reached who had already heard of Ochiru Hoshi, and had already, in small and private ways, begun to take it personally. 3 prisoners taken in late February during clearing operations in the Central Plateau refused, independently, without coordination, to discuss a weapon they described only as the fire that flies. The Marine intelligence officer who noted this in his report flagged it as unusual. Prisoners on Iwo Jima generally didn't discuss tactics at all. The fact that these 3 discussed everything else freely and stopped at one specific topic was its own kind of information. Remember that name, Ochiru Hoshi. You don't earn a name in the enemy's language by being ordinary. The last month of Iwo Jima was the worst of the campaign. The northern plateau fighting was attritional, slow, grinding, measured in yards and days rather than miles and hours. Tanner built 2 more modified rounds from salvaged components, a second HVAR tail assembly from a Corsair that had been shot down over the eastern beaches, and warhead material that he would prefer the logistics chain not to have examined too closely. He used one of them at a tunnel complex near Kitano Point on March 14th. He used the other one at a position that the maps called unnamed and the men of Charlie Company called something much less cartographic, on March 22nd, 2 days before organized Japanese resistance on the island officially ended. He came home with the launcher on his shoulder. After the war, Eli Tanner went back to Macon for exactly 6 months. He worked at bib manufacturing, same lathe, same tolerances, same foreman, Oberst, who said only, "Good. The machine missed you." Then he got a letter from a colonel at Fort Benning asking if he'd be willing to speak, informally, to a group of soldiers in training. He said yes. He went. He spoke informally for 4 hours, which is not what the colonel had intended. But the soldiers in that room did not appear to notice the time. What he told them was not about the launcher. Not primarily. He told them about terrain, the way it channels fire, the way a shadow line creates dead ground, the way an enemy who owns the underground owns a different battlefield than the one you think you're fighting on. He told them about language, not Japanese or German or any specific language, but the language of fear, which is the same in every army, the compressed cadence, the broken syntax, the moment when orders stop and screaming starts. He told them that doctrine exists because it works, and that it works until the moment it doesn't, and that the difference between a soldier who survives that moment and one who doesn't is the ability to recognize, in real time, which moment you're in. A young corporal in the back row asked him, "What happened to the weapon?" Tanner looked at him for a moment. "Which one?" The corporal thought about that. "Either," he said. Tanner said, "The launcher's in my brother's garage. The other one," and he gestured, briefly, at something the young corporal couldn't see, "is wherever you put things that you used up completely." He didn't explain that. He didn't need to. The corporal understood he was not talking about metal. Eli Tanner came home from Iwo Jima with something that doesn't show up in Hargrove's after-action reports. It's not the launcher in his brother's garage. It's not the counseling notation in his service record. It's the understanding, hard-purchased, paid for in volcanic rock and white gold fire, and a name the enemy gave him in a language he half understood, that the gap between what the manual says and what the ground requires is a gap that has to be closed by a person. Not a regulation, not a procedure, a person who was paying attention. That's what Ochiru Hoshi actually was. Not the weapon, the attention. If you were standing in that tunnel complex on February 23, 1945, with one modified round left and 2 Japanese platoons converging behind you, what do? Hold the position like Hargrove said, or fire the last round and collapse the arch? Tell me in the comments. I want to know how you'd call it, and if you want to see what happens when a soldier does this with a different weapon and a different enemy, there are more of these stories waiting. Hit the like button. Subscribe, because the next one involves an Eastern Front mechanic, a German 20 mm autocannon barrel, and a problem that standard-issue American infantry equipment had no answer for whatsoever. Ochiru Hoshi. Falling Star. Some names you earn.